In this lesson, we're going to very briefly cover the concept of an on-path attack. Now, an on-path attack is an attack where the penetration tester is able to put their workstation logically between two hosts during the communication in order to transparently capture, monitor, and relay the communications between those hosts. By placing themselves in the path between the client and the server, the attacker can intercept the authorization packets being sent and received, and then use those to take over the authorized session between the client and the server. Now, there are many different ways of conducting an on-path or interception attack, including ARP poisoning, DNS poisoning, introducing a rogue wireless access point, or introducing a rogue hub or switch. Once an on-path or interception attack has begun, you can then decide to replay or relay the attack. Replay of the data occurs when valid data is captured by the attacker and is then repeated immediately, or is delayed and then repeated. Replay is a common technique in wireless network attacks, but it can also be used in wired networks too. For example, if we can capture an authentication handshake between two hosts, we can then replay it to the authentication server so that it will think we're an authenticated client too and give us access to the network or its resources. Relay, on the other hand, occurs when an attacker is able to become a part of the conversation by inserting themselves in between the two hosts. In this case, the attacker essentially becomes a proxy between two hosts, and they can read or modify any communications between them. When this occurs, anytime the client tries to get to the server, it is instead going from the client to the attacker and from the attacker to the server. From this position, we can capture everything that's being sent between them, including the usernames, passwords, and even bank balances. We can even change the data if we so desire. Remember, relay involves getting the information and then passing it on, or you can intercept it, change it, and then pass it on. The big challenge, though, with replay and relay occurs when encryption is enforced by the hosts. If the server, for example, is using a strong encryption scheme like TLS 1.3, it's going to be very difficult or even impossible for us to intercept and crack the communication between these two hosts. To try and overcome this encryption, a technique known as SSL stripping was created. Since a lot of websites use SSL and TLS as a way to encrypt data between the client and the server, we can attempt to attack this by tricking the encryption application into presenting the user with an HTTP connection instead of an HTTPS connection. For instance, let's say you go to facebook.com using HTTPS, but an attacker was able to redirect or downgrade the request to use the regular HTTP connection instead. This would be considered SSL stripping, because now there is no encryption being used in that connection, and we can then capture all the data and read it. Now, if SSL stripping isn't possible, then we can attempt to perform a downgrade attack instead. In a downgrade attack, the attacker attempts to have a client or server abandon its higher security mode in favor of a lower security mode. For example, if the client tries to connect to a server and negotiate a higher level of encryption like TLS 1.2 or 1.3, but they're connected through an intermediary attacker who's in an on-path position, that attacker may allow encryption to occur, so they'll see that little lock in their web browser, but only at a lower level, such as using SSL 2.0, which is much easier for the attacker to crack. So that way the attacker can remain in the middle of the communications between the client and server and see everything that's going on. Now, it's important to mention that downgrade attacks don't only affect SSL and TLS though. It can actually be used with any kind of encryption or protection, such as Wi-Fi, VPNs, and others. Anytime we have a client negotiate to a lower level of security that is still technically backwards compatible with that higher level, this is considered a downgrade attack.